In the grim darkness of the far future, two figures of unimaginable power materialized in the warped tapestry of the 41st millennium. Dr. Manhattan, the quintessential quantum being, and Tatsuya Shiba, the disciplined student mage, arrived amid the swirling warp storms outside a crusader fleet of the Imperium of Man. Their arrival was neither random nor accidental. A rupture in space-time, a convergence of realities had tethered them to a battlefield that defied comprehension. This is the story of what happens when two outsiders, each godlike in their own domain, walk into the brutal, unyielding universe of Warhammer 40,000. Before we start, don't forget to subscribe and have notifications on. First, let us consider Dr. Manhattan. Once a physicist named John Osterman, he became a being of pure quantum energy after a catastrophic accident. He perceives time non-linearly. He can disassemble and reassemble matter at will. He manipulates atomic structure, teleports, duplicates himself. He is more than human. He is an embodiment of absolute power, while emotionally distant, his gaze cold and calculating. To him, existence is a vast equation. His entry into the 40K universe was like the imposition of a constant bias term in a chaotic expression, everything else recast in relation to him. On the other side stands Tatsuya Shiba, a model student at First High, but in truth, a formidable mage soldier with two contradictory talents. His decomposition ability cancels physical and magical phenomena, while his regrowth power restores matter precisely. He wields tactical magic, calculating and efficient. He is disciplined, calm, emotionally controlled, but not devoid of humanity. His knowledge of strategy, combined with magical prowess, makes him uniquely suited for a tactical environment, even one as savage as Warhammer 40K. But how did these two very different souls come to be drawn into the same war-ravaged galaxy? The rupture occurred in a sector of real space just outside the Black Crusade fleet. A nascent chaos incursion, perhaps aided by a demon engine, tore open a fragment of reality. A cosmic anomaly formed, a mirror of currents, bridging dimensions. Through it, Manhattan and Tatsuya were flung, each pulled by unseen forces, but for separate reasons. Dr. Manhattan, ever attuned to changes in the quantum fabric, perceived the anomaly like a wave in his consciousness. He observed the tear, analyzed it without surprise, and stepped through it, his body shimmering into existence in orbit above a warship of the Imperium. Tatsuya, focused on magical balance, detected a disturbance in the ley line equivalent of warp energy. He calculated the trajectory, stabilized himself, and forced his own passage through the rift. They did not arrive simultaneously. Manhattan appeared first, a glowing azure silhouette drifting in vacuum, his form resonating against the massive steel hull of an Imperial battleship. The vessel's crew, largely servants of the machine god, saw him as a phenomenon, a heresy, or a warning. Sensors registered unholy energy, a presence unlike any Xenos or demonic. Security aboard clamored, but no gun could touch what he was. He merely observed, silent and still, his expression distant. In his mind, he processed the probabilities, the chain of cause and effect that had brought him here. Moments later, Tatsuya Shiba manifested in a smaller shuttle, carefully piloting through the void to make contact, or at least assess. His arrival was less dramatic, yet deliberate. He stepped out in uniform, tactical attire, compact sidearm holstered, his trident-like peridot gemstone affixed to his belt. Even in the emptiness of space, he carried himself with purpose, analyzing, calculating. As they came into proximity, Manhattan regarded Tatsuya with curiosity. Two beings tethered to different metaphysical laws, now sharing the same narrative. Tatsuya, in turn, surveyed Manhattan as a variable in his strategy. If Manhattan is here, how does that affect local power structures? How does his presence skew the odds? From the vantage point of the Imperium, this pair was an enigma, a threat, or a weapon. Words spread rapidly through the vessel's command chain. They called for the Inquisition. They dispatched astropaths. They prayed to the Emperor. If this was warp sorcery, they would smite it. If this was xenoscience, they would quarantine it. If this was a demon, they would burn it. Manhattan, not one for diplomacy, offered no introduction. He spoke only when he chose, his timbre dispassionate. I calculated the risk. I stepped through. He explained the rupture mathematically, with diagrams only he could conjure in his luminous mind. Tatsuya spoke too, in quieter tones, drawing focus to his magic's behavior, describing how his spells refracted in this universe. He did not boast, he simply stated observations. My powers reset matter. They adapt. I sense the warp, but I remain stable. Their words, however, carried weight. High-ranking officers listened, and some believed, but others remained skeptical. Fervent inquisitors, fearful of corruption, demanded proof of loyalty. Meanwhile, the astropaths interpreted strange psychic signatures in Tatsuya's aura, though it did not match any known human psychic footprint. It was as if he were half-warp, or perhaps entirely alien to the usual psychic paradigm. Manhattan's presence disrupted their telemetry, his quantum resonance interfering with their instruments, making his existence hard to categorize. On one hand, the Imperium saw opportunity, a being who could disassemble matter at will, a mage who could nullify enemy strongholds or heal shattered armor. If aligned, they could be the tip of a new spear against chaos, heresy, or Xenos alike. On the other hand, they feared corruption or betrayal. Such power might be a Trojan horse. To test them, the Inquisition arranged controlled missions. First, they sent Tatsuya and Manhattan aboard a strike cruiser held in reserve, under escort. The mission? To inspect a derelict space hulk suspected of chaos infiltration, or worse, of harboring traitor cults. The Inquisition officers, heavily guarded, rode with them. Several veteran space marines watched carefully, wary of interference. As the cruiser closed on the hulk, drifted into its enormous shadow, the two outsiders prepared. Manhattan floated through the ship's corridors without needing to walk, his form lighting up the darkness. He passed through bulkheads, pausing only when the Inquisition demanded courtesy. His aura glowed softly, casting surreal geometry on the steel walls. Tatsuya walked with measured steps, surveying the decks, scanning for warp-corrupted energy or forbidden runes. He performed small incantations under his breath to calibrate his senses, checking the integrity of the hull and the presence of warp taint. Inside the hulk, things grew more sinister. The air was thick, reeking of corruption. Strange runic inscriptions glowed faintly in the dim, flickering lights. The Inquisitors whispered prayers. Space Marines raised their bolters. A low hum, resonating in the bone, vibrated through the corridors. A psychic hum, perhaps, or the echo of long-forgotten machinery. Suddenly, they heard chanting, a ritual in progress. Cultists, draped in red robes, their voices trembling, raised arms toward grotesque icons. They summoned something unnatural. The shadows seemed to coalesce, and the metal walls bent inward as though alive. The air snapped with warp energy. The Inquisition and Marines stood ready, but the stakes changed when Manhattan and Tatsuya moved. Manhattan extended his hand. Before him lay a cluster of mutated cultists. In nanoseconds, he disassembled their molecular bonds, reducing them to inert dust, then reassembled them into harmless steel fragments, effectively neutralizing them without bloodshed. The Space Marines froze, stunned. The Inquisitors choked back anger and awe. He had acted swiftly, cleanly, scientifically. Tatsuya stepped forward as well. He whispered a complex incantation. Shadow matter swirled under his feet, his eyes glowing faintly. With his decomposition magic, he cancelled the warp energy fueling the ritual. The runic inscriptions flickered and died. The cultists gasped, their arcane power collapsing. Where once they stood chanting to their demon, now they recoiled, weakened, as though their connection to the warp was severing. The combined effect was shocking. Ritual power disassembled and dispersed. Warp energy nullified, dissipated. The very walls of the Hulk trembled, but then stilled. For the first time, the Imperium's agents witnessed a power beyond blessing or banishment, something that neither prayer nor bolter could contain. The Inquisition commanders exchanged uneasy glances. Did these two belong to the Emperor's light, or to some new unknown? As the goal of their mission was secured, the Inquisitors pressed further. They wanted to understand their intentions. Manhattan, still glowing with quantum light, spoke softly. "I do not worship your Emperor, but I will not stand idle while destruction unfolds." Tatsuya nodded, his tone calm. "My purpose is not to conquer, but to stabilize. My presence here is a variable. I want to maintain balance." Their presence, however, introduced instability. Word of their power spread across the sector, to the ecclesiarchy, to the Adeptus Mechanicus, to the High Lords of Terror. Rumors spread in hushed corridors, two gaunt strangers with impossible powers, behaving neither as cultists nor as angels. Some speculated that they were heralds of the Emperor. Others whispered that they were demons or Xenos. All agreed on one thing: the 41st Millennium might never be the same. The return journey from the Space Hulk to the Imperial strike cruiser marked the moment when the Imperium began to truly grasp the implications of what they had witnessed. The Inquisition recorded every action taken by Dr. Manhattan and Tatsuya Shiba, every shift in their behavior, every anomaly in the instruments. Yet analysis brought no comfort. Their powers did not correlate to any category of psyker, xenos, or warp entity known to Imperial doctrine. They were something else, something outside the Emperor's design. On board the cruiser, the atmosphere was tense. The crew avoided meeting Manhattan's glowing gaze. Tech priests prayed in binary cant as he passed, unnerved by the disruption his presence caused to machine spirits. Some Marines remained stoic, but even their gene-enhanced discipline faltered when encountering a being who walked through walls as casually as they checked their bolt guns. Tatsuya, by contrast, seemed almost mundane in appearance, yet the subtle ripples of magic he carried were more unsettling to psychers than Manhattan's raw quantum resonance. Warp-scarred veterans felt their skin prickle as he walked by, sensing a presence that somehow rejected the warp entirely. In the briefing chamber, surrounded by hololithic displays of tactical maps, Inquisitor Aristan studied the two newcomers with measured scrutiny. She was not a woman prone to fear, yet her voice held a rare tremor as she addressed them. "What you did aboard the Hulk, those were not miracles nor sorcery as we understand it. Explain what you are." Manhattan hovered slightly above the floor, his posture relaxed. "I see the universe in its smallest components. I do not perform miracles. I rearrange what is already there." Tatsuya stood with his hands at his sides, his expression respectful but unwavering. My abilities are classified where I come from. They concern the breakdown and restoration of information encoded within matter. The closest equivalent here would be controlled denial of certain phenomena. Aristan frowned. Controlled denial, she repeated, as if trying to pin the phrase down. You nullified warp energy. You severed the cultist's ritual as if snapping a wire. That should be impossible. It is simply calculation, Tatsuya answered. Magic follows principles. Even your warp obeys rules, if one can perceive them. This statement caused the chamber to stir with unease. The idea that the warp, chaotic, damning, all-consuming, could be analyzed like a theorem bordered on heresy, yet they had seen the proof with their own eyes. Manhattan shifted his gaze toward the stars, visible through the viewing window. This galaxy exists in a state of perpetual war. Every timeline I observe branches into conflict. Your civilization teeters on extinction. Aristan clenched her jaw. We know the risks. It is why the Emperor guides us. The Emperor is dead, Manhattan said, without malice. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Several guards reached for their weapons. Aristan's voice tightened. Choose your next words carefully. He exists only as a lingering psychic field, Manhattan continued calmly. A pattern bound to a decaying body, but not living in any biological sense. Tatsuya exhaled slowly, not in fear, but acknowledgement. You speak truth as you see it, but you must understand that here, such truths destabilize the foundations of society. Manhattan did not reply. He had no need to. The damage was done. Aristan dismissed her guards with a sharp gesture, though tension remained palpable. She leaned forward, lowering her voice. The Imperium must decide what role you play, if you are assets or threats. There is no need for conflict, Tatsuya said softly. Our arrival was not hostile. We seek understanding, not dominance. Intent matters little, Aristan replied. The power of your magnitude becomes a catalyst, whether you choose it or not. The discussion was cut short when alarms blared throughout the ship. Red lights flashed. The entire cruiser shuddered violently. The Vox crackled with frantic chatter. A voice boomed over the intercom. All hands, brace for warp breach. Repeat, warp breach imminent. The Inquisitor stiffened. Not now. Emperor, preserve us. Manhattan's body emitted a sharper glow, perceiving the event unfolding beyond the ship's hull. Tatsuya instinctively pivoted toward the exit. The Inquisitor motioned for them to follow, more out of necessity than trust. They rushed through the corridors as klaxons wailed. Crews scrambled. Priests chanted, and Marines took firing positions. Outside the viewports, reality folded. A tier was forming, not like the anomaly Manhattan and Tatsuya had come through, but something more violent, something hungry. Crimson tendrils of warp energy lashed out, gripping the cruiser like claws. Aristan's voice was nearly swallowed by the alarms. A demon incursion. This sector was supposed to be stable. Tatsuya felt the pressure in the air. It wasn't magical. It was psychic corruption. His magic reacted not with fear, but with structured alertness. Manhattan watched with detached curiosity, perceiving the dimensional rift as shimmering layers of probability collapsing upon themselves. Suddenly, the ship's forward bulkhead buckled inward as a warp creature forced its way through. Its form was ever-changing, a mass of shifting limbs, horns, and blazing eyes. It roared with a voice that tore at the crew's minds. A squad of Marines unleashed bolter fire, but the demon reconstituted itself instantly. Tatsuya stepped forward. Decomposition, Type 2. The spell tore through the demon's body unraveling it on an informational level. Warp flesh peeled apart into fractal streams of energy. But unlike physical matter, the warp attempted to regenerate, its form rippling back together. He switched tactics instantly. Decomposition. Type 1. This strike hit the phenomenon itself, the warp energy powering the demon. It shrieked, destabilizing as its existence faltered. Manhattan observed the pattern. "I understand." His hand lifted. The air blurred around his fingertips. With a single gesture, he reorganized the quantum structure, binding the demon to real space, severing its coherence. The creature imploded into a burst of harmless light. The crew stared, dumbstruck. Ariston whispered, "By the throne." But there was no time for awe. Dozens more ripples formed along the hull. The warp breach widened. Demons clawed their way through reality, screeching, burning, laughing. The ship groaned under the strain. Tatsuya's eyes sharpened. "This ship cannot withstand continuous breaches. We must stabilize the rift at its source." Manhattan floated upward, phasing through debris. "The tear originates outside the vessel. We must go to the hull." Ariston's mind raced. Letting them outside was unthinkable, but losing the ship was worse. She nodded once, grimly. "Go. If you can stop this, you may have bought your survival." The deck trembled as another monstrous entity forced itself into being. Manhattan glanced at Tatsuya. "Shall we?" Tatsuya nodded. Together. They vanished in a burst of blue light and silent motion, heading toward the breach that threatened to consume the entire cruiser. The Imperium had wanted proof of loyalty. Now they would witness far more. The outer hull of the Imperial strike cruiser was a graveyard of twisted metal and flickering shield barriers when Dr. Manhattan and Tatsuya Shiba emerged. The void stretched endlessly in every direction, cold and indifferent, illuminated only by distant stars and the violent glow of a warp rift, pulsing just off the port side. The breach tore at space like a jagged wound, spewing tendrils of psychic energy that lashed the cruiser's adamantium plates. Each impact shuddered through the vessel, testing the limits of its integrity. Manhattan hovered effortlessly in the vacuum, unaffected by the lack of air or pressure. His blue form radiated a soft brilliance that contrasted with the darkness around him. Tatsuya, protected by a shimmering magical barrier, stood anchored on the hull with calm precision. Even here, in a realm hostile to all organic life, he remained focused, eyes scanning the distortions rippling through the fabric of reality. A cluster of smaller demons spilled from the rift, shrieking silently in the void. They resembled warped, insectile shapes with blade-like limbs and molten eyes. They charged toward the hull, ready to carve their way into the cruiser. Space Marines stationed at the exterior gunports opened fire, but the demons were too numerous, too erratic, and too empowered by the rift to be stopped by conventional weaponry alone. Tatsuya raised a hand. His magic ignited as a pale green sigil snapped into existence beneath his feet. "Material burst," he murmured, releasing a controlled pulse. A sphere of concentrated decomposition detonated in the demons' midst, shredding their forms into particulate dust. The explosion was contained, perfectly calculated so as not to breach the hull beneath him. Manhattan extended his arm toward the rift. With a gesture as gentle as brushing away a curtain, he stabilized the regions of space-time closest to the vessel, preventing further distortions from collapsing inward. "The tear is anchored to something beyond this dimension," he observed. "We must locate its tether." Tatsuya nodded. "Warp rifts are not random. Something is feeding it." He activated a sequence of diagnostic spells, each represented by faint geometric patterns rotating in the air. Warp energy signatures resonated through his barrier, like vibrations running through glass. "There," he said, pointing toward a point deep within the breach. "Something is stabilizing the rift from the inside." Manhattan followed his line of sight. "I see it too." What they saw was a ritualistic construct drifting inside the breach, an amalgamation of flesh, steel, and psychic energy. It resembled a living machine wrapped in chains of warp lightning, each segment pulsating with blasphemous runes. The construct anchored the rift like a stake hammered into reality itself. More demons began spilling out, larger, more grotesque, empowered by the anchor heart. Some were winged, others serpentine, all carrying the unmistakable touch of chaos corruption. The situation worsened with every passing second. On the ship's Vox channel, Inquisitor Aristan's voice crackled through their comm beads. "Status report. What are you seeing?" Tatsuya responded, while preparing another spell. "The breach has an external stabilizer, a warp-engineered artifact. Destroying it will collapse the rift." Aristan replied, "Can it be done?" "By us," Tatsuya said. "Yes." Manhattan did not waste time. He split into 3 identical copies of himself, each moving toward a different flank of the breach. His duplicates formed intricate gestures, each manipulating the quantum structure around the warp tendrils, slowing the demon's emergence. The rift flickered under the pressure like a flame deprived of oxygen. Tatsuya advanced across the hull, each step reinforced by controlled bursts of magic. A massive demon lunged at him, swinging a blade forged from crystallized rage. Tatsuya sidestepped and unleashed a streak of decomposition that cleaved the creature in half, erasing it before its pieces floated away. He continued forward, unwavering. Manhattan's voices overlapped in perfect harmony as his copies worked. "Careful. The anchor heart is reinforced by psychic loops. Its destruction may cause a temporary collapse in reality." The 3 Manhattans merged back into one, then fixed his gaze on Tatsuya. "Proceed, and I will compensate." Together, they advanced toward the breach. The closer they approached, the more violently the warp reacted. Colors that did not exist in the normal spectrum bled into view. Soundless roars echoed through their minds. Time itself wavered, slowing and accelerating in nauseating pulses. Tatsuya felt it immediately. This place interferes with calculation. The warp twisted probabilities, warping even his precise mind. But he adapted, layering stabilizing spells faster than the warp could distort them. Manhattan placed a hand on Tatsuya's shoulder, not in reassurance, but in cooperation. "Allow me." A field of perfectly ordered quantum structure enveloped them both, forcing the warp to recoil. "Proceed." As they entered the breach, the anchor heart writhed, reacting to their intrusion. Chains of warp energy lashed out like tentacles, trying to ensnare them. Manhattan seized one mid-strike, disassembling it into harmless subatomic particles. Tatsuya intercepted another with a barrage of high-speed decomposition bursts, severing the energy links one by one. The construct screeched in a psychic frequency. Its runes glowed brighter, and the entire rift expanded with a violent convulsion. Manhattan frowned. "It is attempting to overload the breach." The anchor heart pulsed with catastrophic energy, a suicidal attempt to tear the cruiser apart before it could be destroyed. Warp lightning erupted from all directions. Tatsuya's barrier flared. "I can decompose the core, but it will resist adaptation." "Then I will restrain it," Manhattan replied. He spread his arms, and time itself froze around the anchor heart. The warp strained against the temporal stasis, but Manhattan held firm. Tatsuya thrust both hands forward. His magic surged, a concentrated stream of decomposition that struck the heart-deep core. Its runes flared violently, fighting back, but the magic ate through them with mechanical precision. "Continue," Manhattan urged, voice echoing through the stilled reality. Tatsuya intensified his assault. Layer by layer, the anchor heart dissolved. Its scream distorted the warp, sending shockwaves through the breach. Finally, with a final piercing shriek, the core imploded into silence. The rift collapsed instantly, not explosively, but cleanly, as if reality snapped back into place. Manhattan reinforced the closure, weaving stable structure where the breach had been. The violent colors faded, the tendrils vanished. Space became quiet again. The cruiser, battered but intact, floated in the void. Inside, the crew stared in stunned disbelief as the warp signatures vanished from their instruments. Marines lowered their bolters. Priests fell to their knees, offering prayers of deliverance. On the comms, Aristan whispered, "Emperor, guide me." Her voice trembled, not from fear of the demons, but from the overwhelming realization of what these two were capable of. Tatsuya floated alongside Manhattan, his breathing steady despite the strain. "The breach is sealed." Manhattan glanced toward the stars. "And now, the Imperium knows what we truly are." Their actions had saved the ship and destabilized the galaxy. News of the sealed warp breach spread across the strike cruiser with the speed of wildfire. What began as a desperate emergency had transformed into an event that defied the Imperium's understanding of power. The tech priests performed rituals of thanks, praising the Omnissiah, while quietly recalibrating instruments that struggled to reconcile the data they had recorded. The Marines, stoic even in the face of the impossible, exchanged glances that were not quite awe, not quite fear, but something between the two. Even the inquisitorial staff, trained to face horrors without blinking, whispered privately about the newcomers. Dr. Manhattan and Tatsuya Shiba returned to the ship's interior without ceremony. They did not seek recognition. They did not expect gratitude. They simply stepped back into the gravity of the ship, as if walking from one room to the next. For a moment, the corridors fell silent, as crew members halted, unsure whether to salute, bow, or flee. Tatsuya responded with the faintest polite nod. Manhattan offered no expression at all, drifting forward with a calm that unsettled more than any demon. Inquisitor Aristan met them in the central strategium. The chamber was dim, lit only by the holosphere displaying the surrounding sector. Its glow cast long shadows across the Gothic architecture, making the room feel more like a cathedral than a command center. Aristan stood alone at first, but as Manhattan and Tatsuya approached, she gestured for them to follow her deeper inside, away from the prying eyes of the crew. When the doors sealed behind them, she exhaled, not in relief, but in preparation. "You have saved this vessel," she said. "There is no question of that. But I must understand your limitations." She chose the word carefully, knowing neither man was likely to accept the idea that they possessed any. "How far does your ability reach, Dr. Manhattan?" Manhattan faced the large viewport, watching stars drift like dust motes. "I can perceive time as a complete structure. I can alter matter at any scale. My limits are defined only by how much intervention I choose to enact." Aristan's jaw tightened. Choice was a luxury the Imperium did not trust. "And you, Tatsuya Shiba?" she asked. Tatsuya folded his hands behind his back. "My power is structured. It has rules, parameters, costs. I can decompose phenomena and reconstruct them. But there are boundaries I must respect to avoid jeopardizing my own life? This answer, ironically, frightened her more than Manhattan's. Something with limits could be understood, exploited, weaponized. Something without them could only be feared. Before she could continue, the strategium doors slid open, revealing a figure clad in ornate blue power armor, embossed with the sigil of the Ultramarines. Captain Varenius stepped inside, helm tucked under one arm. His posture was rigid, but he did not draw his weapon. He addressed Aristan with a formal nod, then turned to the newcomers. "I have reviewed the visual records of your engagement," he said, voice steady but heavy with tension. "By the Emperor's decree, the Imperium recognizes extraordinary service, but it also demands clarity." His gaze hardened. "What are your intentions within this galaxy?" Manhattan turned to face him. "Observation, understanding, perhaps intervention, if I deem it necessary." Varenius's fingers tightened around his helm. "Intervention against whom?" "Against entropy," Manhattan said. "Against the collapsing timelines of this universe. I can see outcomes branching toward extinction. I wish to understand the cause." Tatsuya added quietly, "We are not your enemies, Captain. Our actions demonstrate that much." The Marine studied them. His gene-enhanced instinct told him they were not lying. But truth, in the 41st millennium, was rarely comforting. Aristan stepped forward. "The Imperium cannot ignore power of your magnitude, nor can it simply welcome it." She gestured toward the holosphere, which shifted to display a map of the segmentum. "We are en route to another battlefield, one that may provide context for your arrival." Tatsuya activated a small spell circle on his palm, analyzing the image. "Another warp disturbance." "Worse," Aristan replied. "A Tyranid splinter fleet." Manhattan's eyes glowed softly. "A species driven by consumption." "They consume everything," Varenius said. "Planets, biospheres, entire sectors vanish under their advance. Even our strongest fleets have struggled to repel them." Manhattan drifted closer to the hololithic projection. "Their existence is a closed-loop system. They feed upon galaxies until nothing remains." Tatsuya analyzed the tactical data. "Their structures resemble adaptive magic, self-reinforcing, self-correcting. Fascinating." Aristan narrowed her eyes. "I did not bring you here to admire them. I brought you because, intentionally or not, you have become variables in this conflict, and before we enter a Tyranid engagement, I must know what you will do." "Assist," Manhattan answered. Tatsuya nodded. "Assess, and, if necessary, intervene." "You decide what is necessary?" Varenius pressed. "Yes," Manhattan replied simply. The Marine stepped back slightly. It was not fear. It was acknowledgement of a truth he could not deny. The tension in the room thickened until Aristan finally ended the meeting. "We reach the target system within hours. Prepare yourselves. Whatever your origins, your involvement may shape the fate of millions." As they exited the strategium, Tatsuya walked beside Manhattan in silence. Finally, he spoke softly. "Your understanding of this universe, it is analytic, detached, but these people live in constant survival. Their reality is brutal." Manhattan turned his gaze toward the glow of the ship's lights. "And yours?" "I intervene when necessary," Tatsuya replied, "but I do not decide the fate of worlds." Manhattan floated slightly ahead. "Perhaps you will." Before Tatsuya could respond, the ship lurched violently, alarms blaring across the decks. The lighting shifted to blood red. Vox channels exploded with reports. Something massive had entered the system, a gravitational anomaly strong enough to distort the cruiser's trajectory. Manhattan immediately phased through the bulkhead. moving toward the source. Tatsuya followed, sprinting through the corridors, stabilizing collapsing systems with rapid spells as crew shouted warnings. When they reached the observation deck, the sight beyond the viewport stole every voice. A Tyranid hive ship, colossal, pulsing, alive, emerged from the darkness like a living moon. Its hull writhed with tendrils, biocannons, and rippling waves of chitin. Behind it, dozens more smaller vessels swarmed, forming a silhouette of death against the stars. But it was not the fleet that drew Manhattan's immediate attention. It was the distortion beside it, a swirling knot of warped space. Not chaotic like the warp, but something structured, artificial, and powerful enough to destabilize gravity across the system. Tatsuya's eyes widened. That is not Tyranid. Manhattan stepped forward. A portal, a doorway constructed with intent. Aristan's voice broke through the comms. All hands, battle stations, and find out what caused that anomaly. But the truth was already clear. Someone or something had opened a path into the battlefield. And Dr. Manhattan and Tatsuya Shiba were not the only arrivals in this war. The days that followed reshaped the Imperium's understanding of power in ways no official archives would ever record. What began as a contained observation effort around Dr. Manhattan and Tatsuya Shiba had quietly escalated into a full restructuring of the Inquisitorial Task Force. New contingencies were drafted, new political alignments formed, and new fears whispered in sealed chambers. Every faction that had caught even the faintest rumor of these two outsiders understood that the galaxy had irrevocably changed. Yet the Imperium's leadership still struggled to define the nature of this change. Some saw opportunity, others a threat greater than any Xeno's empire. On the battlefield, however, the truth was starting to reveal itself in unmistakable ways. Reports came from the Eastern Fringe describing a Tyranid splinter fleet advancing far more rapidly than expected. What concerned strategists was not the swarm's movement, but the impossible readings collected by long-range augurs, biological synapse signals twisting in patterns that suggested adaptation targeting a specific psychic frequency. When cross-checked, that frequency bore faint resemblance to the psychic tremor Manhattan's presence generated through the warp. If the Tyranids were truly adapting to him, then the implications were catastrophic. Most saw only danger in this development. Tatsuya, however, viewed it as confirmation of something he had quietly theorized, that any sufficiently powerful entity, simply by existing within the 41st millennium, was capable of influencing its ecosystems in ways the Imperium could not predict. The Imperium prepared for war, deploying multiple regiments and a contingent of Grey Knights. Manhattan, when informed, responded not with urgency, but with a contemplative detachment. He did not see the Tyranids as invaders in the conventional sense. To him, they were the natural consequence of a universe seeking equilibrium. Tatsuya, on the other hand, interpreted the swarm as a threat that could not be allowed to evolve around Manhattan's presence. He understood military escalation intimately. He had fought entities capable of rewriting physics. Yet the Tyranids possessed a different kind of danger, a relentless biological simplicity that ignored logic, strategy, even the basic framework of conflict. They were consumption incarnate. When the first wave of bio-ships arrived, the Void Battle unfolded with terrifying speed. Imperial cruisers engaged with disciplined fire lines, but the swarm behaved erratically, its vectors shifting as if reacting to something beyond material space. In the midst of the chaos, Manhattan appeared on the command deck without warning. As explosions rippled across the view screens, He simply observed, absorbing data not through instruments, but through the fabric of time itself. His voice carried an unsettling calm when he finally spoke. He described the Tyranid synapse network as a living equation, adapting toward a solution that converged on him. To the Imperial officers around him, this was an abstract nightmare they had no vocabulary for. To Tatsuya, it was a tactical puzzle requiring immediate resolution. The two of them departed the command vessel without ceremony. One dissolved into light, the other accelerated in a burst of psionic propulsion so clean it left no warp signature. They arrived on the surface of the threatened world within moments. The Tyranids had already begun their assault. The horizon boiled with living organisms, each one acting as a neuron in the vast mind beyond the stars. Tatsuya assessed weak points, calculating destruction patterns that minimized collateral damage. Manhattan studied the swarm's behavior at a quantum level, observing mutations as they occurred. For the first time since entering the 41st Millennium, the two beings stood openly on a battlefield together, not as anomalies, but as responses to a threat the Imperium could not quantify. Tatsuya struck first. His decomposition magic erased bioforms before they reached striking distance, collapsing their structure into particulate dust. But the swarm adapted with uncanny speed, spawning new strains that attempted to insulate themselves from his interference. Manhattan observed the response with scientific fascination. When he intervened, it was not with aggression, but with modification. A pulse of blue light rippled outward, freezing the swarm not in motion, but in temporal expression. Individual Tyranids continued to move, but their collective intelligence stalled, severed from the synapse consciousness for a fraction of a second. It was enough for Tatsuya to sever key nodes in the swarm's control network. Yet even this combined onslaught produced unexpected results. The hive mind reacted not with retreat, but with deeper evolution. New bioforms emerged, creatures shaped by instinctive attempts to comprehend the two foreign anomalies. One strain radiated temporal distortions, warping localized space-time in ways mimicking Manhattan. Another attempted layered structural stabilization, reminiscent of Tatsuya's anti-magic fields. The hive mind was not merely adapting, it was learning. For Manhattan, this was a moment of profound realization. He had encountered few entities capable of rapid, direct conceptual adaptation. For Tatsuya, the danger was immediate. If the swarm succeeded in fully modeling either of them, the galaxy would face a threat beyond the understanding of the Imperium. The battle escalated into something resembling a cosmic experiment. Manhattan shifted the temporal flow of entire regions, observing the swarm's attempt to solve his interference. Tatsuya dissected biological data in real time, striking at potential vectors the swarm had not yet deployed. The Imperium's ground forces, watching from a safe perimeter established far beyond normal tactical distance, witnessed a scale of warfare that defied doctrine. The Grey Knights, though trained to face demons, found themselves unable to categorize what unfolded before them. It was not sorcery, nor psychic warfare, nor technology. It was two incompatible systems of reality exerting pressure on a third system that refused to yield. After several hours, the hive mind withdrew its surviving synapse nodes, abandoning the world rather than continuing its failing adaptation. The sky cleared. The biomass receded. The battle was over, but something fundamental had changed. Manhattan stood in silence, examining the residual echoes the swarm left behind. He sensed patterns within patterns, signals that suggested the hive mind had not viewed him as a threat, but as a resource. Tatsuya understood the same truth from a tactical perspective. The hive mind would return better prepared. It would revise its evolutionary algorithms. It would treat this defeat not as failure, but as foundation. When the Imperium's forces cautiously approached, both Manhattan and Tatsuya had already reached the same conclusion. Their presence in this galaxy did not merely attract attention. It generated escalation. Every faction, Tyranid, Demon, or Imperial, was beginning to adjust around them. And in a galaxy already teetering on the brink, adaptation could be far more dangerous than confrontation. They both knew the next conflict would not wait long. In the aftermath of the Tyranid withdrawal, the Imperium's high command found itself wrestling with an uncomfortable truth. Both Dr. Manhattan and Tatsuya Shiba had done, in a single engagement, what entire crusade fleets had failed to accomplish. Yet the victory brought no sense of security. In fact, the opposite occurred. Strategic models across Segmentum Tempestus began to show instability in predictions involving Xenos behavior. Threat assessments that once relied on established biological limits no longer aligned with new data emerging from the field. Each recalibration introduced new variables, anomalous adaptations, unexpected retreats, accelerated evolutions. Every inquisitorial analyst examining the situation arrived at the same silent conclusion. The Tyranids had redefined their parameters because of Manhattan and Tatsuya. The Imperium's immediate response was to increase surveillance around both of them. But surveillance proved futile. Manhattan existed in multiple states of awareness, rendering traditional observation meaningless. Tatsuya, despite operating within the physical laws of the galaxy, exhibited capabilities that neutralized standard tracking methods. Psychic scrying failed. Auspex readings dissolved. Even the most advanced Mechanicus monitoring arrays struggled to keep consistent locks on either of them. Their existence within the 41st millennium was pushing against the technological and metaphysical frameworks the Imperium relied upon. Meanwhile, both individuals continued their own assessments. The Tyranid encounter had left Tatsuya with lingering questions that had nothing to do with the Imperium's politics. He had faced countless threats in his own world, from artificial magicians to reality-breaking entities, but never a species that adapted to conceptual interference. He understood combat theory at an almost absolute level, yet the hive mind operated beyond traditional theory. It evolved not by reasoning, but by instinctual mathematics. To Tatsuya, this made it both predictable and impossible to predict. It followed rules, but rules that rewrote themselves mid-conflict. Manhattan approached the matter from a different angle. He saw the hive mind's adaptation as an echo of a universal principle, systems reorganizing in response to anomalies. From his perspective, the hive mind was neither malicious nor benevolent. It was a biological mechanism observing a distortion in its environment. His presence was a distortion, and its evolution was a natural correction. But what concerned him was the temporal resonance left behind after the Tyranid retreat. He detected faint traces of psychic memory, impressions of future alterations the hive mind intended to enact. These impressions existed outside traditional causality. In other words, the hive mind was planning not only on a biological level, but on a temporal one. This realization prompted Manhattan to examine the warp more closely. He had avoided engaging with it directly since his arrival, aware that it was a domain governed not by physics but by emotion and collective consciousness. But now, the warp reacted to him. Its tides shifted when he approached. Demons observed him from impossible angles, studying him the way an organism studies a toxin it cannot categorize. Tatsuya felt these fluctuations as well. His innate sensitivity to information structures allowed him to perceive the edges of psychic turbulence. He recognized the warp as a domain fundamentally incompatible with his existence, yet deeply intertwined with the dangers facing the galaxy. The first major reaction to the Tyranid encounter came not from Xenos, but from chaos. Far beyond Imperial space, in worlds long consumed by madness, the echoes of the battle reached entities composed of thought and nightmare. They learned of the two anomalies not through rumor, but through the warp's instinctive recoil. Something had entered the galaxy that did not belong to the psychic ecology, and chaos, driven by both curiosity and self-preservation, began to respond. The first manifestation came in the form of a subtle warp storm, developing near the fringes of Segmentum Pacificus. It grew not through the usual emotional catalysts of fear or war, but through something else entirely: anticipation. The ruinous powers, ancient and incomprehensible, had identified Manhattan and Tatsuya as variables capable of either destabilizing or reinforcing their long-term influence. And so they prepared the only response chaos ever gave: invitation through corruption. On the ground, the Imperium detected the warp storm's emergence, but misinterpreted its nature. They assumed it to be the result of regional unrest or a demon incursion. But Tatsuya sensed something different. The warp disturbance carried a pattern: subtle, intentional, aimed specifically at the two anomalies. Manhattan confirmed the same. The warp storm's fluctuations aligned with scanning frequencies similar to the Tyranid adaptations. Another entity observing, analyzing, attempting contact. When the two anomalies arrived at the storm's edge, the night sky tore open, not with the violent frenzy typical of demon incursions, but with an eerie, deliberate precision. From the rift stepped a figure clad in shifting shadows, its form flickering between countless shapes. The entity was not a demon prince, nor a lesser fiend. It was something older, an emissary shaped by collective intent rather than individual corruption. It did not attack, it observed. Manhattan approached it without fear. Tatsuya prepared for combat, but he recognized that the entity's structure was not immediately hostile. The emissary's voice, when it spoke, resonated not in air but in thought. It addressed Manhattan first, identifying him not by name but by his presence. It regarded him as an anomaly outside the warp's narrative flow. Then it addressed Tatsuya, defining him as a being neither psychic nor technological, a contradiction that the warp struggled to integrate. The emissary's intentions were not to threaten, but to warn. Chaos had taken interest in them, not out of fear, but out of recognition. They were variables capable of altering the metaphysical balance, and chaos, unpredictable, self-adaptive, limitless in its hunger for influence, sought to shape their roles before the galaxy did. Tatsuya responded with cold precision. He rejected the notion of being shaped by any external force. Manhattan responded with quiet detachment, stating that chaos had no jurisdiction over his existence. Their refusal did not anger the emissary. Instead, it revealed a truth neither of them had fully understood. The warp did not seek control. It sought equilibrium, and their presence had unbalanced it. The emissary faded, dissolving into a storm of psychic particles. The warp storm collapsed behind it, leaving the world silent once more. But the message remained. Manhattan and Tatsuya were now integrated into the galaxy's metaphysical framework. Their actions would not only reshape the material plane, but the warp itself. And chaos, in its own enigmatic way, had acknowledged them. The Imperium, Chaos, and the Xenos were no longer reacting to them randomly. The galaxy was beginning to converge. The galaxy's convergence around Dr. Manhattan and Tatsuya Shiba did not occur with the drama of a sudden revelation. Instead, it unfolded like the slow tightening of a vast cosmic mechanism. Minute shifts in the warp, anomalous fleet movements, psychic disturbances recorded across multiple sectors, political factions adjusting their strategies in ways that appeared unrelated, yet clearly pointed toward a single, unspoken truth. Everyone was waiting, observing, calculating, preparing for an outcome none of them could fully define. In the heart of the Imperium, the High Lords convened in sealed chambers. Transcripts from the Tyrannid confrontation circulated among trusted advisors, each document more contested than the last. Some argued that Manhattan and Tatsuya were weapons whose allegiance must be secured at any cost. Others warned that such power could never be controlled, only directed until the moment it turned back upon those who wielded it. A minority, the most pragmatic, feared that the Imperium had already lost the initiative. The galaxy was adapting too quickly. Manhattan and Tatsuya had become variables the Imperium no longer had authority over. On Mars, the Adeptus Mechanicus responded with a different instinct: curiosity. Explorator fleets shifted their attention. Data priests combed through forbidden archives, searching for precursors to beings who manipulated reality so fluidly. The Mechanicus had always believed in the omnipotence of technology, yet the existence of these two individuals forced them to reconsider the hierarchy of power in the universe. Their fascination was tinged with unease. Manhattan blurred the boundaries of matter and time. Tatsuya surpassed the mechanistic logic they held sacred. The Red Planet, for the first time in millennia, found itself humbled. As for the Inquisition, their reaction was more subtle, but far more dangerous. They divided into quiet factions. Some favored immediate containment, others sought cooperation. A rare few believed Manhattan and Tatsuya should be left alone entirely. But one faction, composed of radical thinkers who viewed the galaxy through a long-term strategic lens, began drafting theories that bordered on heresy. They proposed that the anomalies were not a threat, but a test, a potential tool for reshaping the Imperium's future, assuming they survived the conflicts now forming around them. Meanwhile, far beyond these political machinations, Manhattan and Tatsuya continued their own investigations. They had learned through the emissary of chaos and the behavior of the hive mind that their presence exerted pressure across multiple systems of power. What they did not yet understand was the scale of the convergence, or the degree to which their actions were influencing the galaxy's response. Tatsuya was the first to detect the next major shift. While analyzing the residual warp signatures left by the emissary, he encountered a pattern too structured to be a natural fluctuation. It resembled a summons, an encoded message interwoven with psychic turbulence. But the message was not directed at Manhattan, it was directed at him. The warp, recognizing his existence as a contradictory anomaly, had begun attempting communication. Not through speech, but through information structures encoded in emotional resonance. Tatsuya recognized the intent immediately. The warp sought understanding of his nature. But the warp was not alone. At the same moment the signal reached Tatsuya, Manhattan observed a separate phenomenon. Across multiple timelines, faint distortions began aligning. These distortions suggested the emergence of a new causal event, one not yet manifested, but approaching with inevitability. It was as if the galaxy itself was preparing to produce a counterweight, something designed not to oppose them, but to stabilize the imbalance their presence had created. The synchronization of their observations led them to a grim conclusion. All major powers were adjusting, not just independently, but in relation to one another. The Tyranids adapted biologically. Chaos adapted metaphysically. The Imperium adapted politically. And now, something else, something neither biological, psychic, nor technological, was moving into position. Manhattan described it as a convergence point. Tatsuya defined it more simply, a trap. To verify this intuition, they traveled to a region of space long abandoned by the Imperium. Once a thriving system, it had been consumed centuries earlier by a warp anomaly so severe that even demons avoided its center. The anomaly had recently stabilized, though not naturally. Manhattan sensed interference. Tatsuya detected an informational structure beneath the psychic noise. The two anomalies descended into the heart of the storm. The world beneath them was dead. Cities lay in ruins, half consumed by temporal distortions. Time fractured across the landscape in uneven pulses. Buildings flickered between states of decay and partial restoration. Shadows moved where no light source existed. And at the center of the devastation stood a monolith, an impossible construction of adamantium, obsidian, and a shimmering material neither of them immediately recognized. It pulsed with a rhythm resembling a heartbeat, though no biological elements were present. Manhattan approached first. He placed a hand against the surface. The monolith responded instantly, shifting its internal structure to mirror his atomic configuration. Tatsuya sensed the same reaction through different means. To him, the monolith reorganized its informational lattice to adapt to his analysis. It was attempting to understand them both simultaneously, adjusting its internal logic with every interaction. It was a machine, but not merely a machine. It was a conceptual device, a construct built not to contain power, but to classify it. Tatsuya realized its purpose before Manhattan did. The monolith was not an object, it was a test, a probe designed to determine whether beings like them posed a threat to the galaxy's long-term equilibrium. Its creators were unknown, but its sophistication surpassed anything the Imperium or Mechanicus could construct. Manhattan traced its temporal signature and found something astounding. The monolith did not exist in the past. It existed only in the present moment, as if the timeline had reshaped itself to create it. As the two anomalies studied the construct, the atmosphere around them shifted. The warp stilled, time synchronized, reality condensed. Something was approaching. Not a fleet, not an army, not a god. A presence. One that existed both inside and outside the material plane. A presence observing them with the cold interest of a scientist examining rare specimens. Manhattan turned his head toward the horizon, sensing the arrival first. Tatsuya drew breath, recognizing the onset of a confrontation far beyond conventional warfare. They were no longer dealing with factions reacting to them. They were dealing with the instigator, the organizer, the entity orchestrating the galaxy's convergence. The final confrontation was beginning, and it was unlike anything either of them had anticipated. The presence that approached the monolith did not arrive in physical space. It arrived as a resonance, a pattern in matter, energy, and time that could be perceived rather than touched. The stars flickered around it. The warp recoiled, and even the quantum probabilities in Manhattan's perception hesitated before unfolding again. Tatsuya's senses, honed to detect and decompose anomalies, felt a structure of infinite layers pressing against the limits of understanding. This was not merely a being, it was an event, an embodiment of causality interacting with the 41st millennium as though it were a laboratory. The monolith pulsed violently in response. Manhattan's hand brushed against its surface, and for the first time, he detected intelligence that was not local, not linear, not even confined to the universe as he understood it. The structure of the galaxy itself had been shaped to produce this moment. Tatsuya realized immediately that this was not a trap designed to kill or contain them. It was designed to interrogate them, to measure them against the equilibrium of all things. The entity spoke, not in sound, but in an array of conceptual impulses. Manhattan interpreted them as probabilities and physical laws being rearranged into questions. Tatsuya perceived them as layers of logic, equations embedded in reality, querying their intent, their limits, their willingness to act. Together, they understood the unspoken proposition. The galaxy, the warp, the Tyranids, chaos, even the Imperium had converged to see whether beings like them could be allowed to exist without destabilizing everything. Tatsuya spoke first, using words rather than intent, because he understood the need for clarity. We do not seek dominion. We do not seek conquest. We act where intervention is necessary, and we withdraw where it is not. Our existence does not define outcomes, our choices do. Manhattan, observing the entity through his multidimensional perception, added with quiet certainty, I act according to the laws of time and probability, not allegiance. I do not create imbalance intentionally, nor do I allow it to propagate unchecked. Equilibrium is inevitable. I am simply a factor within it. The monolith, or rather the intelligence behind it, pulsed brighter. Reality itself seemed to bend in subtle waves. Probabilities that had once been fixed now shimmered as if being recalculated. This was the test. It did not attack. It did not judge in a moral sense. It measured, simulated, and projected outcomes at a scale that dwarfed even Manhattan's comprehension. Then came the first visible interaction. Fragments of the Tyranid fleets, corrupted warp entities, and ghostly projections of Imperial vessels were displayed in the void around the monolith. Manhattan understood immediately. The intelligence was modeling the past, present, and potential futures simultaneously, integrating the effects of their presence. Tatsuya saw the logic behind it. Each variable was being tested against their capabilities. How would they respond to a Tyranid onslaught designed to mimic their own powers? How would they confront chaos entities whose strategies bent psychic reality? How would they react to threats that transcended causality itself? The test began. Simulated Tyranid bioforms surged toward them, moving with impossible speed and complexity. Manhattan's perception sliced through the chaos, analyzing trajectories and material properties instantaneously. Tatsuya's decomposition spells struck with precision, erasing forms before they reached them. Yet the swarm adapted faster than any previous encounter. Manhattan subtly adjusted the temporal flow, slowing specific microsections of space-time to prevent critical collisions. Tatsuya then exploited the openings created, neutralizing the most critical nodes of the simulated threat. Chaos projections followed. Phantasmal warriors and demon constructs emerged, their psychic signatures twisting to anticipate their strategies. Manhattan observed, unaffected, manipulating matter at a level that rendered the simulations almost moot. Tatsuya layered spells that intercepted adaptive attacks before they could manifest fully. The two of them moved as one, though each acted according to their distinct principles. Manhattan through observation and manipulation of fundamental reality, Tatsuya through controlled, precise action guided by logical decomposition. Finally, the monolith produced its ultimate simulation, a convergence of all forces, simultaneous in a single instant. Tyranids, demons, warp storms, and Imperial fleets collided with Manhattan and Tatsuya at the epicenter. Probability fields twisted violently. Temporal sequences accelerated and decelerated at random intervals. Logic, physics, causality, morality, all were tested simultaneously. Tatsuya responded methodically. He decomposed unstable structures in the simulation, collapsing the focal points where energy built dangerously. Manhattan, perceiving the potentialities of every action, neutralized paradoxical collapses before they could cascade. Time itself became a tool in their hands, yet neither imposed will for conquest. Instead, they maintained equilibrium, allowing events to unfold while preventing catastrophic disruption. The monolith pulsed one final time. The simulations dissolved, leaving the 41st millennium in its original state, yet subtly altered. The Tyranid fleets returned to the void in scattered formations. Chaos receded, and even the warp smoothed itself around the systems that had trembled moments before. The intelligence behind the monolith had concluded its analysis. Manhattan and Tatsuya had passed, not because they were invincible, but because they acted in accordance with a principle the galaxy itself recognized. Intervention guided by understanding, not domination, could coexist with the universe's complex, chaotic systems. For a moment, the two anomalies stood silently. The monolith receded into the shadows of space, leaving no trace of its presence, yet the resonance of its test remained. Manhattan observed the void, noting the subtle realignments in quantum fields and the warp. Tatsuya studied the patterns left in residual magic and informational structures. Both understood the implications. They had become integral to the future of the galaxy, not as rulers, but as stabilizing factors, variables whose existence would continue to shape events far beyond the comprehension of mortals, Xenos, or even the ruinous powers. The Imperium, still unaware of the full scale of what had occurred, would interpret the aftermath as a fortunate tactical outcome. Tyranid incursions were repelled, warp disturbances had collapsed, and the fleets of chaos were contained. Yet for those who understood the truth, the Inquisitors, the Mechanicus, and perhaps a few prescient minds, the realization was profound. Two entities had entered the 41st millennium and fundamentally altered its equilibrium. The galaxy would never again operate purely according to old rules. As Manhattan and Tatsuya departed the system, the Imperium continued to rebuild. Fleets were redeployed. Warp analysts recalibrated their instruments, and generals revised battle doctrines. But in the silent corridors of command, analysts occasionally paused, noting anomalies in calculations, subtle distortions in timekeeping, and patterns of adaptation in Xenos behavior that could not be explained. These were echoes of Manhattan and Tatsuya's presence, ongoing influences that would ripple across the galaxy indefinitely. In the void, Manhattan drifted alongside Tatsuya. "This galaxy is far more adaptive than I anticipated," Manhattan said. His voice, calm and detached, carried the weight of observation. Tatsuya's expression remained composed. "Adaptation alone is not enough. It is the principle behind action that determines stability. That is why we were tested." They moved silently, leaving the monolith and its lessons behind. Neither sought recognition, neither sought dominion. They had survived the test, understood its implications, and accepted their new role. Not conquerors, not saviors, but variables within a universe striving for balance. The 41st millennium, in all its darkness, ambition, and chaos, would continue. Empires would rise and fall, Xenos would consume worlds, and demons would twist the warp in endless cycles. Yet within that cycle, Manhattan and Tatsuya had become constants, anomalies whose influence would shape outcomes in subtle but profound ways. And as they disappeared into the void, a single, immutable truth remained. The galaxy would never be the same again. Their presence would ripple through time, matter, and causality itself, and the forces of existence, Imperium, Xenos, and chaos alike, would continue to adapt, forever aware of the anomalies that had altered the course of the 41st millennium. The story closes with Manhattan and Tatsuya moving forward into the unknown, leaving the galaxy forever transformed by their presence, their choices, and the test that confirmed them as essential variables in the cosmic order.